I have a reflection for your edification today that I have entitled Heresy. I'd like to say a few things to you about heresy, what it is, how the church understands it. Right off the bat, however, since we live in a culture of relativism, or we might even call it a dictatorship of relativism, in which the only heresy is believing that there is such a thing as heresy. That's the only thing many postmoderns actually think is worthy of the appellation heresy. Because we swim in this cultural milieu of relativism, it's very, very important for we who love God and believe in truth to understand what heresy is. Not to conform to the pressures of our culture, and at the same time not to go the other way and treat heresy like with a casual and irreverent stroke, using it as a verbal bomb against those that we disagree with. That's grotesque. But to have a sober reflection and appreciation for the gravity of heresy. This word heresy, heresis, in the scriptures is very common. It has a broad semantic range in the Holy Bible. In the Old Testament, the word means choice. It means choice. It's used in the Old Testament in many different ways, such as in a reference to free will offerings, which are described in the 22nd chapter of the third book of Moses called Leviticus as, quote, gifts according to their choice, their heresis. In Hellenism, the word heresy or heresis describes various teachings of various philosophical schools, so kind of traditions of belief. Judaism used the word in the same kind of neutral way, merely in a descriptive way, until the 2nd century AD, when it began to be used by rabbis together with its Hebrew equivalent to evaluate and castigate Christians like us and Gnostics. So it took on this pejorative, very negative connotation at this time in the 2nd century, and it's used by Jews. The New Testament itself uses heresis very commonly in many different passages. So, as an example, Acts chapter 24, St. Paul is before Felix, and he says that the Jews malign the way of Christ by calling it a sect. And he uses the word heresis to describe this. It is a sect, and Paul considers this to be a vicious slander by the Jews. In some cases, the word is employed with the same neutral meaning as in the 1st century usage in both Judaism and Hellenism. But in the history of the church, it developed a pejorative, negative connotation and meaning from the very beginning. Besides the meaning choice, it can also mean a chosen opinion, so it can still be used that way, especially in its negative sense. For instance, St. Peter in his second epistle, chapter 2, verse 1, describes heresies as, uses this word to describe destructive opinions, negative and destructive opinions. So these definitions, these three basic choice or negative destructive opinions, these three definitions are united in the church's theological understanding of what heresy is. The true faith is revealed to us by our Lord Jesus Christ through his holy body, the church. When it comes to choice for an Orthodox, the only choice that a Christian has that's legitimate is to accept the faith once delivered to the saints, received, guarded, preserved, and propagated by the Church of the Lord, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That's our choice. We don't have a choice to take the faith and divide it into pieces. Well, this part we choose to accept, and this part we choose to reject, right? What people might call cafeteria Christians. Oh, I will take this, but I won't take that. That is heretical. It is the misuse of choice. Our choice is to receive the faith or not, to be believers and children of the church or not. This is our way. The appellation heretic and the word heresy are used by the Holy Fathers, and this is an important point, both to describe heresies that have arisen within the church, which is its normative usage, and also to describe false teachings, erroneous teachings of false Christian teachers who are outside the church, some who have never ever been in the church. This is also a legitimate and traditional use of the word heretic and heresy. For instance, the church fathers used the word heresy to describe the pagan teaching of Manichaeanism, which never arose from the church, arose outside the church. Also to describe Jewish errors. Also to describe Protestant heresies, for instance. It's not true that the word heresy is only used in the Orthodox tradition to describe errors that have arisen within the church herself, as though it were inappropriate to describe later heresies that never had any organic connection to the church, like the Protestant heresies did not have. Our Holy Fathers have always described Protestantism as a collection of heresies, even though Protestantism never had any organic connection to Holy Orthodoxy. There are many very powerful passages in the New Testament, both in the Gospels and the Epistles, that describe heresy and heretics, the rise and impact of heresies, and how Christians ought to relate to these, such as Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7:15, where he warns us against false teachers. Matthew chapter 24, this is Jesus' great eschatological discourses where he prophesies the rise of heretics and false teachers. The Acts of the Apostles, of course, has many references to heresies. One that's developed quite a lot and is referred to by the Holy Fathers often comes from Acts chapter 20, verses 28 to 30, where St. Paul prophesies the rise of wolves, false heretical teachers in the church in Ephesus that will arise from within the church itself. It's a very powerful text. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 19, where St. Paul describes the necessity for, in God's providence, heresies and schisms to arise so that the faithful can see who are the faithful leaders and affix themselves to those who are true and faithful. Of course, St. Paul, in his listing of works of the flesh, as he mentions fruits of the Spirit, he also describes works of the flesh in Galatians 5. And one of the works of the flesh he describes as heresies and schisms. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's much teaching about this in the pastoral epistles, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. In 1 Timothy, heresies are called the doctrines of demons. And also from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, where he writes that the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, in order to have their ears tickled, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers in accord with their own desires. They will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables, as well as 2 Peter chapter 2 and 3. Both of those chapters have a lot of teaching on this. It's all over the New Testament. That's my point. So as uncomfortable as it is, often to think about heresy, to speak about heresy, to watch for heresy in ourselves and to extract it, to reject it, or from the outside, the concept, the teaching permeates the Holy Scriptures and also the writings of the Holy Fathers. The great Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, in his 3rd century Against Heresies text, writes this. He goes, "It is incumbent to obey the priests who are in the church, those who, as I have shown, possess the succession from the apostles. These men, together with the succession of the bishops, have received the certain gift of truth, according to the good pleasure of the Father. But we should hold in suspicion others who depart from the primitive succession and assemble themselves together in any place whatsoever, either as heretics of perverse minds or as schismatics puffed up and self-pleasing. Or they may be hypocrites, acting this way for the sake of money and vainglory. For all of those persons have fallen from the truth. The heretics bring strange fire to the altar of God, namely strange doctrines. So they shall be burned up by the fire from heaven, as were Nadab and Abihu." Remember these sons of Aaron in the Old Testament who offered strange fire that had not been commanded or revealed by God, and fire came out from the altar and consumed them. Very, very frightening text, Leviticus chapter 10. So the Scriptures and the Church Fathers dedicate a lot of important instruction for our salvation to the subject of heresy. And if you're going to be preparing yourself to be on the Sunday of Orthodoxy service, the first weekend of Great Lent, you're going to participate, of course, in the celebration of Orthodoxy and the triumph of Orthodoxy over heresy. And we will carry our icons outside at the conclusion of the liturgy and encircle the church. And then we will read the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, both wishing many years to the defenders of Orthodoxy, commemorating the great fathers of the church who defended the faith against heresy, and also anathematizing those who have taught heresy in the church, and we all, in a responsorial way, will liturgically reject heresy. Interestingly, when I was becoming Orthodox, just before I made my final commitment to be enrolled as a catechumen, I went to see a very venerable Presbyterian elder who had been a missionary for something like 70 years, 65 or 70 years. I respected him deeply. He was 90 years old and kind of the veteran Presbyterian minister. I went to see him in order to have tea and to tell him, to reveal my heart to him, what I was going to do. That I, as a young man in my mid-20s, was going to leave the Presbyterian upbringing and education that I had received and become an Orthodox Christian. And I was nervous to do it. I was very nervous to do it. But I really wanted to share it with him. I felt that it would be beneficial to me to hear what he had to say. So I met with him and I told him all the reasons. My fear of that I was believing heresies, my lack of confidence in the authenticity and sustainability of our Protestant faith. And I shared it with him very humbly but in great detail. And then I asked him for his opinion. And I was not prepared for what he said. I was not prepared at all for it. He told me first that he knew what Orthodoxy was, and that when he had been a Protestant missionary in Russia, he said, they anathematized me. I had no idea what he was talking about until I became Orthodox and participated in the Sunday of Orthodoxy. He, in fact, as a missionary, had gone to a liturgy in Lent and had heard Protestantism being anathematized by the Russian Orthodox bishops and priests. He also looked at me, and this greatly impacted me, and he said, I understand what you're saying and how you're thinking. And then he kind of looked off and he said, if only I was younger. Deeply, deeply impacted me. So let me sum up, dear ones, about the origins and characteristics of heresy for you to have this in your mind. Number one, the Orthodox Catholic faith of the Christians was once for all delivered to the saints, revealed, whole, pure. Number two, heresy is a parasitical innovation, an alteration of the true faith, and is always incoherent and deficient. It's reductionistic, which is expressed in its being named often after its founder. Lutheranism, Calvinism, Arianism, Nestorianism, etc. Number three, heresy is almost always a deliberate deviation from the apostolic norm due to sin. Common motivations, the fathers say, are a love of the new. It's very much a root of heresy today. The love of the new, discontent, pride, indiscreet curiosity, saying too much, love of power, and greed, especially greed for ecclesiastical office, the fathers say. And number four, heresy develops under the providence of God and is the fulfillment of New Testament prophecies. Christians should not be surprised nor scandalized by the appearance of heresies and should accomplish God's work in opposing them, in ourselves, in our own hearts and minds, in our families, amongst those that we're near. This work includes the love of the heretic and efforts at his or her recovery, as well as the acknowledgement of and affixation to those leaders of the church who are approved. Why is heresy so bad, dear ones? Because heresy does not save. Our Lord Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. Truth, Jesus, the truth, saves. Heresy separates us from our attachment to Christ because we're being bound to something that is not true. Let's make sure that we hold to the faith, that we accept the faith once delivered to the saints and preserved in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Let's make sure we hold to the faith and that we reject heresy. And let us priests and bishops, let me say a word just to you, my brother priests and revered bishops, especially to heed the words of St. Paul to his spiritual son, St. Titus, to exhort faithfully in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict.